Time for what?
Experience in college.
Time for reinforcement.
Time for liftoff!
Where nothing is impossible unless you think it is impossible.
College.
My college scholarship.
Yes.
Boom.
College ran by real fast.
You hung in with the best college.
Let's do this thing.
Genius, let's do this thing!
Welcome to the show, everyone. We are here with a special guest. We have Paul Martin here. He is the founder, from Money Method, a financial advisory focused on helping students and families with college affordability and the financial aid process across the nation. He is also a graduate of Harvard and MIT and has a certificate from Northwestern University in financial planning. But the most important thing that I love the most is he has a passion for this work that stems from his own experience going through the process as a first-gen college student, me too, where he is currently as the director of the first-gen Harvard alumni and the core founder of the first-gen MIT alumni as well. We are so blessed. He has partnered with us and so many other high schools in the Bay Area, and you will understand why quickly. So, Paul, let's get right into the questions, especially for our lower classmen, because financial aid starts earlier, not later in this process. So a lot of times we have questions as college counselor. What would be important for sophomore families to know about college financial aid?
Yeah, really great question. And thank you for welcoming me to your podcast. I feel very privileged to be here and be able to reach the audiences that you also reach, because that's my passion around having as many families as possible know this information. And a key part of that is knowing it earlier. So essentially, sophomore year is a pretty key year, because this is the base year for the income that's going to be used when students apply senior year for their evaluation of financial aid. I always say that it's really important for sophomore families to understand their need eligibility, because we really want those families and students to be able to understand which colleges are going to be the best financial fit. So need eligibility is a key component. And as we have this new FAFSA, new cycle, families can use calculators. There's a calculator on my website for College Money Method for the FAFSA to calculate what's now called student aid index. So this is a number that the financial aid application will use to determine your ability to pay. And using that number, colleges will compare that to their cost of attendance and see if your student has need eligibility. And then the earlier that a family understands their eligibility for need-based aid, again, they can start to think and orient toward colleges that are going to have policies that are generous for them come junior year and senior application, and ultimately their decision making. Colleges do have need-based aid, but the majority of colleges also are very generous with merit scholarships. And we don't want to ignore that corner of financial aid in terms of bringing affordability in. So I think sophomore families, knowing what your student aid index is really key, and that can help you understand eligibility, but also the expectations around your ability to pay. And as I work with my schools, I do talk to families about key aspects of that they may be able to influence.
If I have a high schooler and a middle schooler, I could do this estimator different times. So I could figure out an idea what that is. What other steps should I do right now, today, some actual steps for financial planning for college?
A really important question. So as you use the calculator, you can see there are a couple key components that influence especially dependent students, those students who are considered dependent on their parents, and ultimately their parents will be part of the application process. That's parent income and parent assets. And those inputs that go into that calculator will determine ultimately, based on those primary financials, what a family's ability to pay is. So looking at that calculator, it can be helpful to use it to build scenarios. What if your income were to change over years? How would that change your eligibility? And as well, in terms of the assets, things like checking savings, college savings plans, other ones that are counted, you can also use those calculators to see how changes in your assets would impact that ability to pay. So I think that there are some key aspects that are important. When we're looking at that evaluation, what we do know is that, for example, assets that are in the child's name that are reported will have a higher contribution rate to college than assets in the parent's name. Gratefully, any 529 plan that is counted or reported more specifically in the application is always counted as a parent asset. So that is more favorable. Parent assets, just to give you an idea, the contribution rate is about 5% of those assets reported. For student, the contribution rate is about 20% or up to 25% if the application used is the CSS profile. So knowing some of these rules earlier can be extremely helpful in terms of planning and potentially increasing eligibility over time.
So it's basically kind of like an option of playing things around. Like, I love my intuition is another easier way of putting things in. So I guess, oh, if this scenario, this is what this will look like. That scenario. So sophomore family have time if they do that planning now. And so what are some common challenges that families have experienced in the college financial planning then?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges, and this is well known and documented across a lot of people who write on college financial planning, is that ultimately, there is a process by which a college determines your ability to pay and ultimately your eligibility and your financial aid package. But there's no exact easy way to get to an exact number. Even when we use these calculators, you had mentioned my intuition. And then the next level is that every college on their financial aid website has their own net price calculator. Even in using these calculators, these are estimates, and the estimates might change. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is, instead of focusing on that sticker price, that overall cost of attendance, figuring out what, to the best of your ability, what you're going to be expected to pay after financial aid. And that's where we do have some tools that I think can be very helpful. And I think another key component, and I think this is a missed opportunity sometimes for families, is as you're going on campus to visit schools, make an appointment with financial aid. They are there for prospective students and families. And so having a conversation with financial aid earlier about their policies, using their own net price calculator, bringing those results, talking through those, are all ways that families can get a better sense of what they really want to know, which is college to college, what is my price and what colleges are going to make most sense a senior year application cycle.
So important advice. Also having a blended family, you do get different information everywhere. So start early. And now let's go on to our little bit older families over there for upperclassmen. So when a senior gets an award letter from a college, and sometimes, a lot of times it doesn't come with the acceptance letters, a lot of families expect that. Should one expect that merit aid or that need-based aid or that loan amount to remain all the years they attend that college or university?
I'm glad you asked this question, because I know it can be really confusing, and oftentimes families can get excited, and students should, on their award letter, but we do need to go through that process and figure out really what is that 4-year investment. And I think that's a misstep with families, because it can be hard to understand how this translates. Let's walk through each of these types of aid. So merit scholarships are often renewable for 4 years. Merit scholarships are actually, while they may come in your financial aid award letter, they are determined by the admissions committee. These are recruitment tools to really incentivize parents and students ultimately to enroll in college. So because they're used as a part of recruitment, most merit scholarships are renewable for 4 years as long as the student's maintaining academic eligibility. And you'd want to see what those academic eligibility requirements are, typically usually a 3.0, so that a student's merit scholarships are renewed. So there is more durability with merit scholarships, again, because of that renewability. But there can be some merit scholarships that are what they call incentive to enroll. So that might be a one-time scholarship for visiting campus or other things. So figuring out which merit is durable. And again, this is where we need to be advocates and reach out to admissions if there's any questions about that merit component of financial aid. Now, turning to need-based aid, this is a component that can change year to year, because a family will be expected to submit the FAFSA, or in some cases, the FAFSA and CSS profile to college if they require that. So they can be reevaluated for their eligibility, because some families have changing circumstances, may not have that steady income. So if we have a change of circumstance where a family might, maybe a parent is going into retirement with reduced income, need-based eligibility can increase. But at the same time, if families are doing better in later years of college and they're reporting more income or assets, need-based eligibility can decrease. So again, that's an important component is, your 4 years might not be 100% predictable, but if you are aware of changes in your financial life that are coming around, using net price calculators to see what that change might look like can be helpful. And again, reaching out to financial aid and being more transparent. I think families think, well, if I tell them things are changing ahead of time, there's going to be a problem. But no, it's actually working proactively with those offices that can be important. The final question around loans, student loans in particular, have a set amount per year, but we do see those amounts increasing slightly year to year. So typically first year will be offered about $5,500, but in the second year, they can be offered up to $6,500, and their final 2 years, $7,500. And most times colleges will lean on loans to help in that financial aid. So we can see a growth in loans over time. So these are really important questions. As I'd mentioned, families really looking through that four-year process is important. And then reaching out to universities for additional guidance, particularly for need-based aid if we feel that there is going to be changes in financial circumstances.
Thanks for setting the limit on the loans. So many times kids like, oh, my parents just get a loan, all the rest. I'm like, no, that's like over 10,000. And I don't know if that's wise. Or about the need-based aid. Like my husband always say, well, I'm going to get a raise. I'm like, well, guess who needs to pay more for the what? Yes, it's what you need, not what you want.
Right.
And then the saddest part is when I have a student who just get a renewable merit aid. And, sometimes they'll have like a 2.8, 3.0, and the students will go, that's easy. But college is such a different world with so many wonderful distractions and sometimes really big distractions where sometimes that student had to dip into a loan because they didn't meet that merit aid guideline. So ask, communication, always key.
Yeah, I actually work with a family and a student where there was a decision between two colleges with pretty equal merit, but one had a requirement of a 3.5 GPA versus a 2.0. And the student wanted to challenge themselves with a degree in physics. And that was a breaking point in their decision in terms of the college. The student was equally interested in both colleges, but having to maintain that high of a GPA seemed a bit overambitious for the student. So I'm glad you brought that up. I also do want to mention that this is from a personal story, that need-based financial aid and financial aid offices are there to help students as circumstances change. Personally, when I was an undergraduate, my father became disabled in the middle of my sophomore year. And as that part of that, he was unable to work. So I was able to go back to financial aid through my special circumstances and appeal. And I had aid adjusted mid-year. So please be advocates for yourself. If you do have changing financial circumstances, clearly those that might be changing, unfortunately, in a more negative direction, continue to have a relationship with financial aid and ask for what you need and ask them what the process is for reconsideration.
Thank you for sharing that story, because a lot of kids don't realize if a door is closed, just knock. And if that door doesn't open, knock on another door, because that's why they're in that profession. It's not just pushing numbers, but to make kids' dreams come true for them and their families. Let's go into another question. So when time seems to be running out to figure out how to change their investments on debt situation. So this is specifically for families who haven't done the planning, like, oh my God, this financially is different. So I know like at my school, we try to do our best to be really generous. And then families get surprised, like, wait, why aren't colleges all across the nation just as generous as the high school? How can they handle that? What's next best thing to consider when they do have maybe large assets, or they do have a big debt situation like credit cards, which a lot of colleges don't take under consideration when they're applying to colleges for those families that still need financial assistance?
And I know that so many families find themselves in this space where they feel like need-based financial aid isn't necessarily working in their favor because it can be pretty formulaic. And if there are assets to report, essentially, those are reported and are counted. And in our process, as you mentioned, debt isn't part of that consideration. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But with those facts being what they are, that is, and this is why I tell families, understanding your need-based eligibility earlier can help you orient and have conversations with your college counselors for college selection more for merit-generous colleges. I have seen students, and I know you've worked with students, that can be surprised that they're getting half of their tuition covered by merit scholarship. Or in some cases, for some of these more prestigious scholars programs at universities, it can be full tuition for 4 years. So there is absolutely paths to affordability, even when families feel like need-based aid may not be available to them. And that's why, as uncomfortable as it might be, understanding that eligibility earlier and understanding there may not be that much opportunity to increase eligibility for need-based aid will help students and families be oriented to the vast majority. And we're talking about probably 90% of colleges that have merit opportunities and are merit generous, and then bring that together in your junior year search when you're looking at colleges and exploring that with your counselors as well?
Yeah, we did an experiment with our students where there's a college that was so well endowed, but the family had some generous assets, and the students were surprised, like, wait, wow, they had to pay so much. But the school down the street, which maybe is not as big as a name, but a great name, they could start research even quicker than at this other counterpart campus, got so much money, even though the family had even more assets than the other.
Yeah.
So, it's really by case. So look around and see your college counselor help you with that list.
Yeah, I always say there's typically for any one college that a student's very interested in that might not be generous in merit aid, there's probably 5 corollary colleges or even more that working with your counselor will be the right academic fit, the right social location, and even better is going to be generous and be the right financial fit for that family. And so we don't want to shut down those opportunities and have those and it's more to have those conversations earlier to open those opportunities.
Oh, yeah. And I tell students, if the school has that much resource, imagine all the stuff in the everyday life, if they're being that generous. So a topic that a lot of people don't talk about is a conversation about for our wonderful families who need to be aware about situation if the parent is undocumented and or if the student is undocumented. So what's some general advice for first, for those who, students are U.S. citizens or permanent residents, but their parents are undocumented, and then if the student is undocumented?
Yeah, very, very good questions. And, I know in California, we may have, across the country, we have situations where we have families without documentation. So one important thing to know, particularly if the student it has citizenship or eligibility through their citizenship, is that it's only the student that needs to be a citizen or an eligible non-citizen, which could be holding an A card or having a green card, that would allow that student to have equal access to all financial aid that every other student has, even if the parents may be not have documents, or whether one parent might not live in the U.S. Those things aren't relevant. What we look at in our financial aid system to be considered a domestic student eligible for aid is the student's citizenship. That is important, can be a bit of not be so intuitive for families. And once we have those circumstances, working with your counselor to understand, well, how do specifically parents contribute to forms like FAFSA and CSS profile? And there are ways that both of those applications allow families to submit the information so students can be fully considered. If a student's undocumented, it is really important to have that information come forward with counselors earlier, because depending on the state, there can be amazing resources that can help that student achieve their college dream, even without having access to federal aid or the FAFSA. And there are many colleges have very generous policies around students without documentation. So that is going to be a cornerstone of that relationship with your high school college counselor, is being clearly transparent about that so they can help navigate that process for you.
In every financial aid office that I've worked with, whether the parents undocumented or the students are, they've been so helpful and also honest, like, this is what we can do. This is what we can't do. And I think some students are surprised if they're willing to, look beyond, what's just around them, how generous some other campuses. And there's some complexities about that. So yes, start early, have that conversation. Many doors will be open. Now, there's another door that maybe not as many people were excited about. It's called the new FAFSA form, right? I mean, how many times has it changed? In total?
Well, we have a lot of changes in terms of when it's going to be delivered to colleges, but this is a pretty major change, and this is the change year. So students applying for 24, 25 aid and parents for that matter, are tackling the new FAFSA. So yes, there's a lot of changes that are going to really increase the amount of federal aid that goes out to students, which are positive, but it has been a little bumpy, to say the least.
Whether someone's a senior or going to be, or who's going to be a rising senior or younger families, like with this soft launch, the missteps, the calculation, the interesting calculation system that we had to calculate again. What's your professional perspective on the changes, how this may affect colleges who require just the FAFSA and, no documentation, and then the other colleges who require FAFSA and the CSS profile?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I want to be clear that as you had mentioned, there are some colleges that only require and look at the FAFSA for all types of aid. So we're talking about federal aid, potential state aid, and then their institutional aid. We have some colleges that still require the FAFSA to understand federal or state aid eligibility, but will replace the FAFSA with CSS profile when evaluating a student for their own institutional funds. And this year, those colleges are having a bit of an advantage in terms of being understand that those circumstances earlier, because CSS profile did open on October 1st. Now, there's still open questions for colleges because there have been so many changes to the FAFSA in terms of whether the FAFSA is going to continue to be the right form for them to evaluate students for institutional aid, because there's a lot of shortcuts to the new FAFSA which really benefit the student and parent when completing it and help provide much more federal eligibility. But the question is how colleges feel about that. And I think some of the big changes that are pretty well known out there are FAFSA no longer accounts for the number in college at the same time. So families that have multiple students in college at the same time, that is no longer a factor in eligibility. It used to be a positive factor, meaning that it can increase a student's eligibility if their sibling was in college. FAFSA no longer accounts for that. CSS profile continues to. So some interesting examples that I've explored or I've actually consulted on are families that have twins going into college that are have high need. And those families, as it turns out, oriented to colleges that still use a CSS profile or continue to use, because there's a lot of advantages in eligibility. So all to say, in terms of future cycles, we do know that we should have that October 1st open date for students and families, whether it's FAFSA or CSS profile. But I do think we're going to be in a couple of years transition for colleges as they evaluate the new FAFSA to see whether they're going to require maybe move to CSS profile, or we could have a case where colleges are going to ask for supplemental information in order to ensure that they have all the information they need, particularly for institutional aid. And I just want to be clear that FAFSA is the only form that's required or that can be required to receive any federal aid a student is eligible for, and typically state aid. But when an institution has their money, they get to set the rules on how they give that money out. And traditionally, FAFSA has been the common denominator for the majority of colleges or vast majority of colleges. But again, as we have a new FAFSA, that might be changing, and we'll have to see. Keeping abreast of that information, counselors have access to those changes and talking to financial aid offices again when you go on campus about which forms they use and the potential of what changes there might be in terms of those requirements to receive their institutional aid is important.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning the supplementals, because whether it's a FAFSA only school or a CSS profile school, there's so many more campuses asking for these supplementals because they're trying to help families and, also to make sure to understand the family situation. And yeah, it's very interesting, the changes. I've been doing this for so long. I remember parents going to college used to be part of the formula.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful that my kids who are bunched together is already pretty much done with their college journey. So parents, families really need to be more involved, not controlling, but advising, using the net price calculator, my intuition, talk to financial aid, let the kids handle the admissions, let them handle, how they're going to be themselves and shine. But, kids, don't know always the financial situation. So, there needs to be a partnership. Definitely with everybody. So any last words of wisdom, how, families can, get more wisdom from you, or just about in general for financial aid for colleges? Yeah,
I think like I say is to be proactive. I know this is a nerve-wracking part of the whole college journey. It's like, what does the money look like? But earlier understanding of what, again, need-based eligibility will look like for you as a family, and being able to determine how generously you may be awarded need-based aid, or in the case that that might not be the case, moving toward colleges that have merit consideration, I think is really important. Using the resources, those calculators that are available, those can be extremely, extremely helpful to provide those insights, which is really what families want, is how much am I going to be expected to pay, and working with with counselors and being more transparent about financial needs with your counselors, not having to share your income, etc. But when you can do some of the research on your own and say, I might not be as need eligible as possible, let's start talking to our college counselors about merit generous schools. I think that helps counselors do their job. I know every school I work with, every counselor is concerned not just about getting a student to college, but making sure that students leave college and families leave the college experience financially well. So being in partnership with your counselors and being more transparent, I think can really pay back dividends in terms of having those colleges selected that are going to be most generous with your circumstances and ultimately give you that affordability that you're looking for.
Amen to that. And, and also thank you for being an example, sharing your story, how you had to be an advocate for yourself, how you continue in other outlets to be an advocate, and then how you've helped teach our families how to be advocates as well. So thank you so much, Paul.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That's just the tip of the iceberg. To find out more, go to collegeforall.com. That's college4all.com. You have to find out the latest, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Look for College, 4, All.